Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Milken Institute London Summit. To begin the program, please welcome CEO of the Milken Institute, Mikhail Khodorkovsky.
Good morning. Good morning. Delighted to see so many of you here today. I want to welcome you to this, our 8th annual Milken Institute London Summit. As we hope you know, the mission of the Milken Institute is to build meaningful lives and increase global prosperity by facilitating discussions and collaborations that widen access to capital, create jobs, and improve health. We do that through our cutting-edge research, through our real-world activities in trying to improve policy, and through sessions like today's, and the many private sessions we've held over the weekend, which are designed to bring some of the brightest, most influential people in the world together in the hopes that as you listen to the discussions, as you participate in them, that you'll start seeing the world slightly differently, get ideas that you hadn't had before, and come away feeling that you have a different perspective than when you started. Well, the theme for the summit, as you all know, is navigating a changing Europe, and it reflects the political, cultural, and financial uncertainties that confront Europe and the world. Now, the panels today are going to explore some of those challenges. They include artificial intelligence, aging populations, financial stability, geopolitical risks, gender disparity in workplace, superbugs, and, of course, a topic no one here has spoken about lately, Brexit. Now, before we begin, let me just give you a few housekeeping tips that'll help you to make the most of the summit. If you haven't done so already, please download the Milken Institute's app. It's going to help you navigate the conference. It has the speaker bios, panel descriptions, and room locations. It also enables you to network with other attendees and to provide feedback at the end of each session, which we hope all of you will do. You can also join the discussion at #MIGlobal on our hashtag, I should say, #MIGlobal, shows how old I am, and our various social media channels, so I hope you'll do that. Now, we have a very exciting program today, which has a topic which is very much at variance with much of what you'll be hearing, because it's a topic about the world is really better than you think. We're going to have 3 leaders in the field of optimism, Anna Rosling-Roland, Matt Ridley, and one of the world's great optimists, Mike Milken. Now, as part of the session, Anna plans to use you, that is, your responses, to her short 13-question quiz on the state of the world. There's a link on the homepage of the Milken Institute Events London Summit app, so you can easily take the survey, and hopefully each of you within the last few minutes has received a notification about it. So please click on the link to the quiz, take the survey. It won't take more than a few minutes, and thanks in advance for doing that. It'll help to make the luncheon that much more enjoyable. All right, enough with housekeeping. As much as I know you'd like to have me stay up here for another 45 or 50 minutes, I think it's time to turn to our first panel. The future of the United Kingdom and the European Union. We have a great panel, and it's moderated by Stephanie Flanders. Stephanie is a senior executive editor at Bloomberg, head of Bloomberg Economics. She was previously chief market strategist for Europe at JP Morgan Asset Management in London, economics editor at the BBC, speechwriter and senior advisor to U.S. Treasury Secretary Lawrence H. Summers during the Clinton administration, and a reporter for the New York Times. Please join me in welcoming Stephanie and our wonderful panel.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm inclined to think the session about why the world is better than you think is going to be the antidote to this session, where we try and persuade you that it's even worse than you thought. Everyone's writing their outlooks for 2019. I know I was last week. And I was struck that this is the sort of stage in the economic cycle where politics really has a good possibility of upending and getting in the way of the economics, shortening the cycle. And the UK already is a prime example of that. As someone who lived here for many years and had heard many of, again and again, the economic benefits of membership of the EU, we've seen politics and some of the forgotten political concerns come back to bite the British establishment in a big way. And we have speakers here who are very much still involved in those debates. But in Europe generally, I think if we look around, there's plenty of scope for politics to intervene. We have the European elections, we have President Macron dealing with his yellow vests almost as we speak, the demonstrations in Paris. I guess, is it a sign of globalization that now even the French demonstrators are not very well dressed? But we had elections in Spain at the weekend. And I think for me also concerns about a very important change of personnel that we're going to have in Europe over the next year, really consequential for many investors and people involved in markets. If you're going to perhaps have not only Mario Draghi, but also Chancellor Merkel leave the scene by the end of this year, in quite a critical year for European economic policy. And then there's Trump, relations with Trump. Where is the trade war going from a European standpoint? And how are we thinking about how is European policy evolving, if it's evolved at all, around President Putin? So we have plenty of things to discuss. We have a reasonable amount of time, although it's never enough, obviously. And we have great speakers. I should say, if those of you who are looking for the former leader of the AfD party in Germany, you will not find her here. She was taken ill yesterday, Frauke Petri, and I think he would not consider himself to be a close replacement for Frau Petri, but Alan Houmann, Head of Government Affairs, Global Government Affairs for EMEA for Citi, has very kindly stepped in and will be talking to us about these European issues. He's on my immediate left. On my far left is Jo Johnson, MP, former transport minister, who famously, for many in this room also, had resigned from the UK government recently over the Theresa May's Brexit plan, wrote a very eloquent article about why he'd taken that choice. We will get into that in a minute. To my immediate right, Peter Mandelson, Lord Mandelson, of illustrious career in Labour politics and now chair and founder of Global Counsel. And on my far right, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who is very well known to people attending Milken summits and has most recently, his reputation precedes him, but his most recently is founder of Open Russia. So all the things I talked about, they have some pretty interesting views on. We're not going to sort of start with big opening statements. I want to get into some of those topics I mentioned first, but I know everyone's going to be able to have their say. But Jo Johnson, I have to put you on the spot. We are not, I promise you, going to talk about Brexit for all of this hour, but we have to talk about it a little bit, sitting as we are in the shadow almost of Parliament. You said in your article for the FT, explaining your decision to leave the government, that for the government to leave the country with such a bad choice, I'm not saying it quite as nicely as he did, but such a bad choice essentially between vassalage and chaos in respect to Brexit, was a failure of statecraft on a par we had not seen since Suez. I saw some people think it's actually worse than that. Where do you think we are?
Well, thanks, Stephanie, and good morning, everybody. Yes, I did say that in my resignation statement. I thought it was an unacceptable choice for the government to present the country with, on the one hand, a deal that's going to leave us poorer and less in control than we are under our current arrangements, and on the other hand, the option of crashing out without a deal with chaos and disruption to our business supply chains, to people using our transport systems. I thought that was a complete failure of statecraft as a government to present two totally unacceptable outcomes to the country. And it's why I felt it was unsustainable for me to stay within the government, because clearly there are alternatives. We don't have to accept that limited choice. We're a big country. We're whatever it is, fifth or sixth largest economy in the world. We are capable of generating alternatives for ourselves that aren't as disastrous. And I felt we've missed that opportunity, and we need to put it back on the table.
And how is that? Do you think how is that going to play out? Because your view, I think, is similar to many people in Parliament at the moment who are looking at this very important vote next week, about to have start to debate Theresa May's proposal. How do you think at the moment it's going to play out over the next week or so?
Well, the next 8 or 9 days are going to be some of the most significant in recent British political history. There's no doubt about that. MPs feel that they are living, and Tony Blair's famous phrase, with the hand of history on their shoulder. Right now, we are holding meetings which we feel will have an impact not just on our fortunes over the course of this Parliament, but over the course of coming decades. And we're all particularly aware of it as constituency MPs. When I look at my constituency in Orpington, it's a constituency on the southeast edge of London, and I have many constituents who work in financial services, which is one of the sectors that's actually extraordinarily received, in my view, scandalously little attention from the government over the course of the last couple of years. It's almost it's barely mentioned in the proposed withdrawal agreement and future declaration on the political declaration on the future agreement, future framework. And yet, it's going to be hard hit. When I look at the government's own economic analysis for the impact of this deal, the government's own deal, let alone no deal or other scenarios, the financial services sector is going to be 6% smaller over the relevant forecasting period than it would be under our current arrangements. We have very few globally competitive sectors in the UK, but financial services is certainly one of them. And I see no reason why my constituents in Orpington, many of whom go into the centre of town every day to work in jobs of all sorts in financial services, should be subjected to that kind of hit. Now, the government is peddling the idea that somehow this is a great liberation for our financial services sector, that we'll be free to set our own rules and regulations and sort of sail the global seas. In fact, I understand that we will be required to cleave quite closely to European positions in global financial standard setting bodies. So this illusion of freedom that we're somehow acquiring for our financial services sector, I think, is wholly misleading, and we need to push back very hard on that in the coming days of debate.
Peter Mandelson.
Well, Joe and I are on opposite sides of the political aisle, but I think on this question of Brexit, we are in agreement that the British government is following a disastrous approach to what is a very flawed idea. The government it says it's either May's way or no way, and that if we don't accept her deal, then we will simply crash out of the European Union with all the catastrophic disruption and chaos that would ensue from that. I don't actually think that is going to be the case. I think that if her deal is defeated and that exit deal that she has negotiated is no longer politically viable, and that if Britain is still heading towards departure in next March, then the EU will move fairly rapidly to a set of mitigating emergency measures. We will go into a sort of improvisation phase in which the most extreme damage and the worst excesses of what would occur were we to do nothing will in fact be avoided. It doesn't provide a solution to what Britain's longer-term relationship is with its nearest and biggest trading partner. That would continue to be in abeyance, and we'd have to address it in some way in the most dreadful circumstances, because I think it's true to say that the EU has pretty much exhausted its sort of reservoir of goodwill insofar as that has existed during the last 2 years. due to the shenanigans of the UK during this whole negotiating process. And I think that, anyway, let's not go there. I think in the meantime, what Mrs. May is offering the British people, is a choice between leaving the European Union, but still continuing to follow the rules of the European Union, in which case you have to ask yourself what the point of leaving is if we just continue in that sort of state of vassalage, as Jo says. Or she's saying, no, the alternative, as promoted by the real Brexiters in her cabinet and party, is that we will have a clean break. We'll break with the EU, break with its rules entirely, in which case we will pay a colossal economic price. That is the real choice. And it's not a choice that the British people were told of, warned of. It's completely the opposite of what they were promised or led to expect when they took this vote, which is why actually I believe that most of the senior members of the government itself no longer really believe that the whole thing is the right thing to do. They can't admit it. They have to sort of cling to each other for sort of warmth and comfort. But actually, I think the belief in Brexit has even left those who were its original die-hard advocates.
Well, although those two
we're
things
still
are different.
doing it.
I mean, the extraordinary position we've been in is actually the government all this time trying to implement Brexit has been dominated by people who did not campaign for Brexit, did not necessarily believe in it. And all the original Brexiteers have either not been in the government or have since left it. So I guess you could say that right at their heart, they've never really wanted to do it anyway.
Even the strongest Brexiteers are now saying that what Mrs. May is offering is a worse deal for Britain than if we were to stay in the European Union itself.
To go back on one thing you said, because one of the complaints that the Brexiteers have in the lead up to this vote is that that a gun is being held to their heads in the form of no deal and all the horror scenarios of no deal, and that that MPs are being pressured to sign up for this flawed, in their view, deeply inferior position for fear of the chaos that Bank of England and others have unveiled or estimated last week. You're sort of suggesting that actually they're right, that the no deal isn't really as bad as Theresa May's making out, that we wouldn't really all just walk over a cliff.
Well, I'm not an advocate of no deal, and I wouldn't embrace it willingly, but I don't believe that when push comes to shove and we were actually looking over the cliff at the abyss below, that either the UK government or the European Council would take one further bold step over the cliff edge into the abyss below. There would be, the rigidity of the EU would quickly turn to emergency flexibility in those circumstances.
That matters for the business community, actually, because you're being faced... the businesses, we tend to assume, would choose stability, even if it's inferior stability with less control over rules and with less of a role for financial sector. I think that, the business community, Alan, here, has been faced with a very difficult choice the last few weeks because, and I think they're somewhat divided as to whether they should sort of cling on to this deal because it will at least offer security of contract, security of rules, or to shoot for something that long-term might be better, but short-term could be disastrous. Where do you think people are when you talk to businesses?
So I think transition was always going to be important, critical, and it still is. It is the most important thing for the industry. And for transition to happen, there must be a deal. The treaty must be agreed. Whether it's this particular deal or some other version of it, I think the industry is more agnostic. It's certainly not great for the industry. The treaty, as Joe said, the industry is hardly mentioned in the agreement. I think we get 3 short paragraphs in the political declaration. Now we're told that that's all to play for. That's the launching pad for an ambitious set of negotiations later, but there's very little in it just now. So I think the industry, yes, you're right, it is a little bit divided, but I think what they're desperately trying to avoid is a crash out. Because I think the economic consequences of that for us, and more importantly for our clients, would be pretty severe.
But that's why I wonder that's why you haven't heard the likes of, I don't feel like I've heard companies, even in the broader economy, let alone the financial sector, coming out strongly for rejecting this deal or taking that kind of position.
I think the balance of the views inside the industry are that we must avoid a crash out, and therefore, you may not like it, but it's better than crashing out. And I think the fear of the crash out is driving a lot of the thinking.
I mean, I suspect if it's fair to say we don't have a broad range of views on Brexit represented on this panel, which I should say is not for want of trying by the organisers, but we might well. And Theresa May's had the same trouble trying to find Brexiteers for her cabinet. But we might well find, we could talk for another 5 minutes and we'd find ourselves walking closer and closer to a second referendum, I imagine. And I think the big worry that people have and the nervousness that people have had about talking about that is the potential political backlash of the many people who voted for Brexit, not really because they had a considered view, although some did, but a number of people voted just because they wanted to give the system a kicking and they felt that the system had not been delivering for them. If you say, well, you gave us a kicking, but now you know what, we're not actually going to deliver on this, many people are worried about the long-term political consequences of that. Mikhail, I just wonder, when you're sitting from your perspective, given everything that you have seen in Europe for the last few years, do you think Britain should be careful of having a second referendum that might make people feel that they had been cheated of what they wanted?
Меня самого очень интересует, как проголосуют люди, если будет второй референдум.
In fact, this is the question I'm pondering. How people would vote if we were to have a second referendum?
Это совершенно очевидно, что многие люди, делая свой выбор, не были точно осведомлены, к чему этот выбор может привести.
I mean, it's absolutely clear that when many people were making their choice, they were poorly informed about the results or the consequences of their choice.
И мне это очень знакомо по моей стране.
This is very familiar looking at Russia as well.
Well, this is why, Joe, firstly, I guess, what odds do you put now on us ending up with a second referendum?
Well, it's not what odds I put on it. When I look at the odds that the bookies are putting on it, on average it's about 6-4, which I think gives an implied probability of somewhere around 40%. Now, of course, bookies may or may not get it right, but that's a higher implied probability than pretty much any other outcome, certainly a higher implied probability than the PM than of the PM getting her deal through next Tuesday, I would say. But look, I think we shouldn't... But
there's no guarantee, just to Mikhail's point, there's no guarantee that the Remainers would win a second referendum.
No, of course there's no guarantee, but there was a poll by YouGov, again, we have to take polls with a pinch of salt, of course, but there was a poll by YouGov on Sunday that suggested if the question was the PM's deal or remain in the EU under our current arrangements, that Remain would win by 57% to 43%, or 55 to 45 if the question was just Remain or leave. Those are substantial shifts versus the 52-48 leave Remain that we saw in the June 16 referendum. So I think something is changing, and I think the demographics, when we look at those polling results, are very interesting. All demographics are seeing substantial shifts, except for men over the age of 55, towards Remain, or towards seeing the benefits of our current arrangements, our current deal within the EU. Now, of course, we can't be certain of that result. But one thing I think is for sure is that we can't be scared of our own shadows in this process. If we're too afraid of testing public opinion because we're worried that elections are going to be divisive, then I really think we risk ceasing to be a democracy altogether, and we risk encouraging those very violent elements in our politics that are scaring people from participating in public life and having frank and honest conversations with others about their views.
But if we spent the last 2 years being reminded why referendums are a really bad tool for deciding anything, then having another one just sends a message that, well, you can have a second, you can have a third.
Yeah, but
you can have a
okay, but I
fourth.
think you're falling into the trap of seeing this as just another repeat referendum, a rerun of the 2016 referendum, when it's clearly something very different. 2.5 years on, we now know what a negotiated Brexit looks like because we've got a 585-page legal treaty in front of us. We've got a 26-page political declaration. Whereas in the June 2016 referendum, we had fantastical visions of an idealized Brexit painted by campaigners that have proved over the subsequent 28 months to have been undeliverable in reality. So I think it's fair to go back and to ask the public to say, this is the Brexit that's actually been negotiated and is available. Do you want to proceed on that basis? And if you don't, there is an opportunity to reconsider. I don't think it's the same referendum as in 2016. It's an evolution of the process.
And I guess we should remember it. And of course, technically, it wouldn't be a second referendum, it would be a third referendum. But Peter Mandelson, suppose Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, supposedly is moving closer to this position because there is such a big majority of his party in favour of Remain, and that has increased over the last few months, and certainly since the referendum. But you're someone who had a profound effect on support for the Labour Party and bringing Labour, in some sense, into the modern age in the 1990s. Do you worry about the political backlash that might come from a second referendum, from a lot of Labour constituents, even in Joe's constituency potentially, feeling cheated?
Stephanie, there's a sort of unspoken sort of premise in what you're saying, that out there in the country as a whole, there is a majority for Mrs. May's deal, and that if it were to be rejected, you know, half the country would be very disappointed. I think we have to understand.
There was a majority for Brexit of some kind 2 years ago.
Well, I'm sorry to be pedantic, but you know, 37% only of the British population voted for Brexit. Now, the current polling would indicate that amongst those who voted to leave in 2016, only 40%, less than half of those who voted to leave, feel any sense of conviction that what Mrs. May is proposing is right for the country. Now, that means that in the population as a whole, something less than 20% of the population actually believe that what she's proposing is right. Now, and you're saying that that 20% has to hold the 80% of the population to ransom somehow, that we've just, because we're afraid of sort of anarchists and right-wing thugs taking to the streets and fomenting violence, that the rest of us have just got to sit back and let this disaster just unfold in front of our
But hang on, in your poll, what percentage of people were in favour of no deal? Because it's certainly not as high. It's not 80% who are in favour of Remain at this point.
People would prefer to remain in the European Union than to have no deal. I think it's 50% want to remain, over 40% who say, no, let's go for a no deal. So that's a 10% margin. It's slightly more than the margin between those who want to remain in the European Union as against those who favour Mrs. May's deal. So, look, I'm not saying that opinion polls are infallible, you know, or that our entire politics has got to be governed by whatever the most recent polling results. But heaven knows, you know, can't we start taking account of what most people feel in the country about Brexit, about this deal? I mean, we're like a bunch of people who have piled into a car and decided to hair off in some direction towards a destination that nobody can define, that nobody sort of knows what it is, yet nobody in that car seems to have the gall or the gumption or the decisiveness to take their foot off the accelerator, stop the car, get out, and reflect on what the hell we're doing to this country. I mean, it's crazy. You know?
I think you described the situation well. It's just not clear quite where the outcome will be when the same divisions you're talking about will probably make it quite hard to come up
but
with
here's
what
the
the
point.
two questions
Here's the
are
point,
for a
Stephanie.
referendum. What would be the two questions in
Come
a
on,
referendum?
here's the point. Here's the point. The politicians have dug themselves, since the referendum, into a deep hole, okay? This is where we are now. Who's going to dig us out of that hole? Is it the same politicians who can't agree amongst themselves within their own parties, let alone between the parties? Or do we have to take it back to the people and ask them to dig us out of the hole? Not necessarily, by the way, to say that they reject Brexit or to reject, a true Brexit or whatever, but at least to take a decision so that the entire country knows that it's a decision taken as a result of a further democratic vote rather than what is a squalid, very suboptimal compromise cobbled together between competing factions within a Conservative cabinet. Now, how do you think people in this country will find it easier to live with the outcome of this Brexit? As a result of this a deal that nobody likes, neither Remainers nor Leavers, or as a result of a further decision by the British people, which both sides will then have to live with. Either way, whatever the result, everyone else pipes down and lives with it. That's what we've got to do. I think it's the only basis on which we're going to bring the country together.
That was what was supposed to happen after the other one.
But it didn't.
But Peter
for all the reasons
Peter has well presented the reasons why many people, certainly in Parliament, are beginning to think they are heading towards a second referendum, that it's the only way for the major parties to avoid resolving their own differences if you kick it to the public. And I think that's definitely right. But I think that you've also, all of you, shown great bravery in standing up for the financial sector against this audience. I think it's very... But we're going to...
The financial sector is simply going to be thrown under a bus under this deal. And heaven knows it represents 12% of the Treasury's revenues. What's going to happen to our public services in this country as a result of a shrinking financial services base when the Treasury starts to lose that sort of revenue?
And Joe is right that argument has been heard remarkably little in the last few weeks. Alan?
And just to be very clear, to Peter's analogy of the car, we do feel like we're being dragged along in a trailer. We can't quite see where this car is going. So all that uncertainty, whether it's another referendum or some tweaking of the deal, is going to take us well into next year. And I guess the EU 27 will have to agree perhaps an extension, so even further into European Parliament election territory, perhaps. And I think there's a sense that, given that uncertainty, business is making its plans. Our plans are well reported and extremely well advanced. And new facts are being put on the ground because of this political uncertainty.
I think that's...
Subsidiaries are being created. Clients will have access to the European markets regardless. So unless this is sorted extremely quickly, the critical path will have changed.
I think that's right. Your mention of the European Parliament is going to allow me, I'm going to sort of quickly try and jump out of that trailer onto a speeding bus in the other direction and talk about Europe. How are you looking at the European elections, but also some of this, people look at the demonstrations in France, say this was the great hope of the sort of liberal mainstream hope. President Macron, now extraordinarily unpopular in his own country, facing these threats. We have the elections in Spain. Are you concerned that we're going to have maybe more politics than we were expecting this year in Europe?
Absolutely. So if the populist parties appear to be aiming for 30% of the European Parliament, that will definitely have an impact on policy, because the Parliament will have to see its views reflected in the Commission, which it will elect in due course. And so the entire European policy framework could shift, and we're trying to analyse quite what that would mean. No one has too much experience of living in that sort of world, but it does feel to us a diversion of policy away from economics and into social policies, migration issues, family issues, and we do worry that, therefore, the emphasis on market integration, the single market, for example, which is very important to most businesses, that will be displaced by radically different policies. So the real-world effect of populism could be to see a shift away from sensible market efficiency questions into issues that we didn't really have much to say about, but certainly would be quite concerned about.
Peter, you worry when you look at the dynamics around the European Parliament. I mean, the European Parliament has not always driven the agenda for the European Commission, it's fair to say, but it can make a difference.
It can make a difference, and we're likely to see, as a result of the European elections next spring, a more fragmented European Parliament in which populist and nationalist forces are likely to be more rather than less represented. And that's not going to make either for market efficiency or efficiency of policy making in the European Union. But let's understand why this is the case. It is because so many people, not just in Britain, but across Europe and indeed across the West, are turning towards nationalist and populist parties because they feel that established rules and institutions and mainstream political parties, are not delivering for ordinary people and their families. They feel that the outcomes that they're living with are too unequal in society, that the benefits and rewards of prosperity are not being fairly distributed, and as a result, we're seeing inequality in our societies become a major driver of political instability and ever-mounting political risk. And part of the responsibility for this, in my view, is an inadequately functioning relationship between the European institutions, not just the European Parliament, but the Commission and the Council, and national governments and national capitals. There is not a clear sort of balance or division of responsibility in respect of key policies that are needed to make our capitalist market-based economies run better in the interests of all. I felt this when I was Trade Commissioner of the European Union. My job, and the job of the Competition Commissioner in Brussels, was essentially to push a liberal, market-opening, liberalizing agenda. It was essentially an agenda in which we in Europe embraced globalization and all its consequences as we were undergoing other major structural economic changes in Europe and across the West. Not just the restructuring of supply chains that were becoming globalized, but the whole sort of shift from manufacturing to services. The advent of automation, of machine learning, and now AI, which itself is having a further profound impact on production, on work, and the labor market. Now, all these structural shifts are underway in our economies, having a major impact on our societies and our politics. Are we, as well as embracing those structural changes, also pursuing the policies which actually are more the responsibility of national governments and national capitals rather than the liberalizing policies being pursued by the Commission in Brussels? Are the national governments making it possible for people to live with those structural changes and not feel that there are ever-mounting numbers of losers rather than winners as a result of the unfolding of these changes? And so there's a lack of, I think, as it were, integration between national and European-wide policies. I think there is an inadequate distribution of responsibility, and I think instead what we're seeing is buck passing between Brussels and the national capitals. With the national capitals busily, blaming Brussels for their sort of pro-globalization, pro-liberalizing policies, and Brussels in turn saying that you national governments are not intervening enough to make the consequences and impact of these changes livable with for the bulk of people.
Mikhail Khodorkovsky, do you think when you look at Europe and you look at these now, we are still having supposedly surprising success of the populist parties, the far right in Spain this weekend and other places. Do you feel that European institutions are responding to the kind of fears that Lord Mandelson suggests, or how can they do better? Do you worry about where it's moving?
Мы видим, что популизм – это не специфическая проблема только Европы.
I think we see that populism is not just something about Europe or specific to Europe.
И поэтому вряд ли стоит перекладывать ответственность именно на органы Европейского Союза.
So I think it would be wrong to blame just the European institutions for what is happening in Europe.
То, что мы видим, это некие проблемы демократии, которые сейчас видны во всем мире.
I think it's the problems democracies are experiencing worldwide.
Как из них выходить? В общем, это можно обсуждать, но не стоит в попытке выйти из вот этих проблем демократии разрушать то, что уже создано.
We should debate on how we should actually try and get out of the situation, but I think we shouldn't try and destroy what we have in the attempt to do that.
Для меня, например, очень понятно, что и глобализация в целом, и Европейский Союз в частности дали огромные экономические преимущества.
I can see, and there is no doubt for me, that both the globalization and the European economic area, the European Union, have created a lot of economic advantages, great advantages.
И то, что у этой медали есть другая сторона, недостатки, ну да, у каждой позитивной тенденции есть негативные стороны.
But of course, every positive trend has a negative underlining. Every medal has two sides.
Right. Well, that's why we're going to need our positivity session later on. Joe Johnson, I mean, as a minister, but also before that, you've had a great interest in these issues. How do you see the dynamics in Europe, and particularly these kind of the institutional capacity to respond to some of these threats?
Well, I think Britain's relations with the European Parliament are paradoxically, if we do Brexit, going to remain as important today, as important in the future as they are today, because one of the great failures of Brexit has been to fail to deliver on the promises that were held out that we would somehow take back control and increase our sovereignty. The reality is we will be rule takers, and those rules will be shaped in the Council, in the Parliament, in the Court of Justice and elsewhere, but henceforth without our representation in those institutions. But year after year, month after month, week after week, members of Parliament such as myself will be having to rubber stamp rules and regulations that will have been made in those same European institutions, but without us having any hand in shaping them going forward. So what I see as unsustainable in this new arrangement is the enhanced democratic deficit that we're now embedding in our political structures in this country. For me, I think it's completely unsustainable and unacceptable for a democracy such as ours. Now, if we do succeed in getting a referendum, and that might well require the permission of the European Council to extend the Article 50 process to allow the referendums to take place, we will be in a position where British MEPs would be potentially having to take their seats either just before or just after the July 2nd moment at which the 5-year period of the Parliament comes to an end. But I think it is important that Britain is represented in these institutions, that we maintain our influence with them, and that we continue to exercise our ability to amend, build blocking majorities, and improve legislation in our own interests. And that's what I think is going to be so sadly missing under the proposed deal that the Prime Minister is putting forward.
Can I add a postscript?
Yes, although I noticed we've gone back to Brexit, which was not what I was trying to do, but anyway.
I don't want to go back to Brexit. I want to say this about the European Union. If by some miracle, Britain is able to sort of airlift itself out of this pending disaster, and we go back,
helicopters circling,
and we go back into a European Union where again we have strength, influence, a voice, a vote, etc. we've got to start working for a rather different European Union than the one that is operating at the moment. Let me explain what I mean by that. I'm obviously former commissioner. I love the European Commission, obviously. But I tell you what the Commission and all the European institutions are good at. To use a sporting analogy, they're very good at playing strong defense. When it comes to defending the status quo, when it comes to defending the existing rules, when it comes to defending the existing order, the existing relationships between the institutions, and also, I have to say, the existing relationship between those institutions and the general public, they're very good at reaching the lowest common denominator of agreement in order to keep things as they are. We've got to see a European Union that is, frankly, a little bit more inspired, a bit bolder, a bit more pro-reform, pro-change. It's got to engage in a lot more rethinking through how the European Union is going to be and how it's going to operate during the course of this century. And that means a little less strong defense and a little bit more front foot and going onto the offensive. Now, the question then is whether the European Union's cohesion and unity will endure as it goes to a higher level of policy making and reform and change, rather than simply falling back onto that strong defense, as I said, of the status quo. But I do think it's got to find some vision, it's got to find some strength, it's got to start taking some initiatives, otherwise they will see that the sorts of pressures that are currently operating in Eastern Europe amongst member states and which have produced Brexit will be difficult, more difficult to manage and to control across the European Union as a whole.
I think so Peter Mandelson, I think he's calling for total football approach to European policy.
I am a bit,
for those of the, and you can all, those of you who are not familiar with total football, you can look up 1970s. But Alan, if that is the challenge, actually independent of what happens with Brexit, if the challenge for Europe is to become more active at a time when actually people are doubting the European institutions, are feeling kind of not really in favor of more integration and more of those kind of actions. The fact, as I mentioned at the start, that we're going to have two key figures potentially of the European politics and policy of the last 10 years, Mario Draghi and Chancellor Angela Merkel, both have potentially will have left the stage at the end of 2019. How likely is the kind of prospect that Peter is talking about? I mean, we've talked repeatedly about these opportunities for reform. It doesn't actually feel like this year is a great year for it.
No, I mean, we're tracking very closely President Macron's ideas of European integration, but we're also tracking very closely what's happening in Poland and Hungary, which seem to be countervailing forces at the very least. So the integration core of the original six, maybe minus Italy, versus the fragmentary or outer circle of Eastern Europe. And it's very hard to know which side is going to win, or maybe they both win, and Europe forms these concentric circles of influence. That is definitely not conducive to the single market and economic efficiency, which is, I think, where the business perspective would come. And how you then choose a central bank governor, president of the ECB, in those circumstances is of course, problematic, and that immediately feeds into economic policy, monetary policy, and how this is all pulled together. So I think there is...
With Italy sitting right in the centre of all of it.
Absolutely. Italy is key to this. And, you know, the Italian government's head-on collision with the European Union over its budget is deeply concerning, because, I mean, the last thing we want to see is a Eurozone crisis in the middle of all of this. And so these things are all on the table now, I think.
Well, then I think, and that's obviously one of the worrying things about the last few years and the recovery in the Eurozone, is that Italy is still no further away from a major crisis, at least a questioning of its debt sustainability, than it was a few years ago, and everything potentially coming to a head around that normalization of monetary policy. But Mikhail, I mentioned the potential for Chancellor. Well, we know already that certainly in the not too distant future, Chancellor Merkel will be replaced, maybe sooner than we thought. Some of the front runners to succeed her have been making more negative noises about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and President Putin in general. Do you think there's a potential for a better policy towards Russia? How do you see the importance of the change in leadership in Germany?
У Путина сейчас не самое простое время.
I think Putin is living a difficult time now.
В российской политике вот за последние полгода он совершил несколько серьезных ошибок.
In the past 6 months in Russian politics, he has made quite a number of serious errors.
В результате его рейтинг упал до крымских величин.
So his rating has actually plummeted to the pre-Crimea ratings.
В прошлый раз он разрешил эту проблему с помощью военной авантюры.
So you know that last time he actually embarked upon a military adventure of sorts in order to resolve this plummeting rating problem.
В этот раз это было бы ошибкой, потому что у населения другое настроение.
But I think it would be a mistake to repeat it this time, because the public now feels otherwise, different.
Но может ли он совершить ошибку? Да, может.
Which could he, in fact, make the same mistake? Yes, he can.
Вот, то, что его на сегодняшний день интересует более разобщенная Европа, это без всякого сомнения.
There is absolutely no doubt that he has a vested interest in Europe being as disunited as possible.
Потому что это интересно с экономической точки зрения, как ему кажется.
Because he thinks that economically this is in his interests.
На сегодняшний день Россия является в своем сегменте монопольным поставщиком энергии, и хотелось бы, естественно, говорить с разобщенным покупателем.
So at the moment, in its segment, Russia is a monopoly supplier of energy to Europe, and therefore he would be delighted if Europe was as sort of disunited and split as possible as a buyer.
И, во-вторых, с политической точки зрения, также европейские санкции вызывают, естественно, неудовлетворение. И, конечно, хотелось бы разобщенной Европы для того, чтобы с этой проблемой справиться.
And of course, from the political point of view, the sanctions are biting, and therefore there is dissatisfaction in society, and therefore he would want to see a split Europe in order to cope with this problem at home.
Я не убежден, что секторальные санкции с политической точки зрения делают то, что Европе хотелось бы.
I don't think that sanctions in different sectors of the economy are actually achieving the aim that Europe has set itself.
Но совершенно очевидно, что Кремлю они не нравятся.
But it is clear that the Kremlin doesn't like them.
И то, что, несомненно, Кремль опасается, и то, что Европе, как мне кажется, имело бы смысл делать, это перейти к более точной идентификации противника.
But I think what the Kremlin is really afraid of, and what Europe should really start doing, is to try and identify where the enemy really sits in a much more sort of honed-in, focused way.
И этим противником является не Россия.
And the enemy is not Russia.
Противник — это Кремль и очень небольшой круг людей вокруг Кремля.
It is the Kremlin and a very small group of its supporters.
И когда с ними пытаются бороться, ударяя по большим площадям, то они как раз из-под этого удара легко уходят.
So when Europe is trying to, or anybody else is trying to fight the Kremlin by hitting broadly across the whole country, this is exactly something that helps the Kremlin, because they actually find ways out of the dilemma that they found themselves in.
Я очень надеюсь, что следующие европейские лидеры в этом отношении, так сказать, будут более таргетированными.
So this is why I think what the future European leaders should do is to target people in the Kremlin in a much more focused way. And I hope that they will.
But what you said at the start is concerning, or is very striking, because we also have, I think when we spoke at the summit, the Milken meeting in LA earlier this year, the oil price was going up. Now it's going down. That also plays into this. Should we be concerned that now President Putin will feel he has to do something dramatic? I mean, you said it was a possibility, but does the oil price play into that as well?
Пока цены на нефть остаются на достаточно высоком уровне.
I think oil prices are still quite high.
И упадут ли они до драматических для Кремля величин, я не могу себе этого представить в ближайшем будущем.
And I cannot imagine that they would fall to such a low level that it would make a dramatic change for the Kremlin.
Кремль себе яму роет сам достаточно успешно.
I think the Kremlin, to go back to what Peter Mandelson was saying, is digging a hole for itself in a rather successful way.
Но вот выбираться из этой ямы он, конечно, попробует в том числе за счет Европы.
But getting out of that hole, the Kremlin would probably try to do with the help of Europe as well, or at the expense of Europe, rather.
Okay. I promised that we would also say a little bit about transatlantic relations and Europe's emerging thinking about President Trump, if there is any emerging thinking. Alan, we're trying to decipher what came out of the G20 at the weekend, and there'll be other sessions probably talking about that. But there was a view when President Trump was elected that it actually might galvanize Europe and force them to be more active on some of these fronts. How do you think that view's working out? Do you think President Trump has sort of pushed European direction potentially in a positive direction?
I think it's quite difficult to discern where this might go. I mean, we're very concerned about the possibility of a trade war. And I think, each individual measure may not matter that much, but in the aggregate and what it says about the direction of travel is concerning. It was interesting that the initial impact on Germany was picked to be the target, but Europe coalesced quite quickly to make clear it was a European competence, and it was Juncker that went to talk to the US about trade, not Merkel. So I think Europe, as Peter Mandelson said, is very good at playing that sort of defense and actually saying, no, this is a European competence. We will discuss it as a European body through the Commission. And I think that was probably the right answer. But a trade war, if it kicks off, would be detrimental to everybody. And it's not just the EU, of course, it's with China and other countries. So there's a sense of apprehension, I think, that we're on the brink of something quite bad.
Joe Johnson.
Well, I came back from Washington on Monday, and what really struck me when I was there was that for the first time since the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions, and for the first time since the Second World War, we've now got an administration that is actively fostering European disintegration rather than European integration, which has been the consistent sort of policy objective of the US in Europe. And I think this is a truly alarming prospect.
But not succeeding, according to Alan.
Well, I think it is, and it isn't. I mean, certainly Brexit, sorry to return to that, has been something which President Trump has been one of the most vocal champions of. I think he has an aggressive trade policy in the sense that he wants to pick off European countries one by one. Brexit is one means for him of achieving that objective. Weakening the European Union further enables him to, in time, strike a more favorable trade agreement with the rest of the European Union minus the UK. And I really am concerned by my colleagues in Parliament who believe that they can fall back on the WTO as a means of defending Britain's trading positions in disputes as and when they arise, because US attitudes towards the WTO look likely to weaken that in the short to medium term and not to strengthen it. And in any case, even in its current shape, and Peter knows much more about this than I do, but even in its current shape, the WTO doesn't offer much by way of protection for the services sector, 80% of our economy.
But, I mean, Peter, I think at various points this year there was a disagreement among senior European leaders about how best to respond to President Trump's trade threats, some people wanting to actually do a deal with him and others sort of wanting to hold firm more. Where do you think Europe is? I mean, there does seem to be a prospect of kind of indefinitely delaying an actual imposition of tariffs. But
I think Europe is on two tracks with Trump. Track one concerns his threatened Article 232 measures on grounds of national security against the imports of European manufactured cars. We are awaiting a report from the Commerce Department on whether national security is threatened by the volume of imports of European cars. And what Juncker did, and in this sense scored a sort of tactical win here, was to go to Trump and say, look, consider your cars, hold back, don't take precipitate action against European manufacturers. And by the way, why don't we have a sort of wider discussion about trade liberalization between Europe and the United States, in which cars can form a part of the discussion, and that's the second of the two tracks. But one thing I'm absolutely sure about is that the second track, you know, the wider liberalization issues, a rather more focused, narrow version of TTIP, will not go forward. It will not happen whilst Trump is holding a gun to Europe's head over the import of cars. If he proceeds along track one and takes action on cars and demands that Europe operate self-limiting measures in order to reduce its exports to the United States, and the United States under threat of closure of its market, by the way, in breach of WTO rules, then any possibility of a wider free trade liberalizing negotiation between the United States and Europe will be off the agenda.
But to Joe's point, is there a possibility that Trump's pressure is actually revealing some of the weaknesses in the WTO and will inspire the supporters of a more multilateral vision to make some changes?
One thing I think the impact of Trump has had on Europe is to foster a belief in European unity, that we have to stand together in Europe in the face of US unilateralism. It's strengthened Europe's commitment to the multilateral system. It has increased Europe's commitment to NATO. It may even result one day in higher European spending on defense, on its own security. I don't hold your breath, but I mean, that's a possibility as a result of Trump's behavior and his turning away from Europe and turning away from Europe's outlook and interests and Europe's respect for collective security and the multilateral system. So, you know, there may be a European silver lining on this. I'm not, you know, I'd say don't hold your breath, but it's a possibility. As far as the WTO is concerned, there was one line in the G20 summit communique which said that the G20 is united, ho-ho, in its desire to address a WTO reform agenda in which WTO rules would be updated and modernized to take account of changes in the global economy and the international trading system, for which read, you know, the re-emergence of China. Trump wants to destabilize and, if possible, bring down the WTO. It represents everything he finds disagreeable. i.e. it's international, it's multilateral, and it's not slavishly pro-American. Therefore, he wants to destroy it. So he is undermining it, he is weakening it, but it is strengthening Europe's commitment to prop up and to save the WTO, which is very, very important if we're going to sustain anything like the rules-based international trading system that we've been creating over the last few decades.
Well, I think, despite my best efforts, we actually have ended up in a more positive place. So I'm going to quickly wrap up before anybody can say anything. I think we have one of those. We can see that there is perhaps a silver lining coming from and a force for good coming in some of the things that we've been most worried about. So Brexit, as we established, going through the total mess that Britain is in at the moment. Theresa May have failed in many objectives, but she has succeeded in uniting the nation against her plan, which is no small thing. And we now have also the idea from Lord Mandelson that President Trump has been able to bring Europe together and potentially even strengthen the multilateral system, though that could be a stretch, strengthen the multilateral system by his efforts. And we've also got that from Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the notion that actually President Putin is not going to be feeling very happy at the moment, and his opinion polls are going down. So maybe we are in a slightly better place than we thought, but I hope you enjoy the rest of the day, and thank you very much for all my speakers.
Thank you. Thank you.